Namaste and welcome to the Bharatvaarta podcast. Recently, one of the tallest leaders of the OBC political movement, Shri Kalyan Singh, passed away. And it was a moment of reflection for all of us. And we thought we'll use this episode to delve deeper on the history and significance of the OBC political movement itself, right? To make sense of all of this, I have with me our resident political expert, Rohit Jayaraman, who you've heard on multiple Bharatvaarta podcasts before. Rohit has rich, insightful anecdotes, examples, and insights to offer, on this topic. So, hey, Rohit, welcome back. So, Rohit, let's begin with this phenomena of OBC politics itself, right? So, how do you see this? It's also something which is pan-India, right? It's truly a mass movement. Your initial thoughts on this whole phenomena?
Sure, Roshan. So I think when we use the term OBC politics and in this current context, because the immediate trigger for this episode itself is, of course, the death of Shri Kalyan Singh. I think I'd like to start by saying that Shri Kalyan Singh is probably the most appropriate person in whose memory we can do such an episode, right? Because he combines the fusion of two things, that is OBC politics and Hindutva, which is today the dominant political ideology in India. In the sense that today in state after state, in both the 2014 and the 2019 parliamentary elections, as well as in a lot of assembly elections that have happened. Of course, while various communities, including the urban upper castes and middle class, etc., have all supported the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi. A lot of the alpha, you could say, that came into the BJP between 2014 and 2019 to 2014 and 19 really came from OBCs across India. So a lot of that, of course, there's a lot of aspirational politics involved, a lot of developmental politics, but it's equally important to understand that there's a lot of Hindutva politics involved in that, right? In the sense that even today, if you look at Indian mass culture, if you see that Hindutva is gaining in popularity, or it's become more of a player in mass culture today than it was, say, 10 years back. A lot of that has to do with the inroads this movement has made among people from the OBC community, right? And that's where Kalyan Singh matters, because Kalyan Singh was one of the first, probably the first fusion of particular brand of politics, right? At the same time, having a caste identity as an OBC leader, and at the same time fusing that with Hindutva. So that way, this is really a very good occasion to have such a discussion. So I'd like to start off by saying that. Then moving on to what you asked, see, OBC politics in a way is very different from all the other kind of politics we discuss, right? Like when we talk about minority politics, or Dalit politics, or even tribal politics, or even upper caste politics, right? All of these politics differs from OBC politics in a very significant way, in the sense that it differs from state to state, right? Like OBC politics, more than any other particular social groups politics, really depends on the state, and that's because of what OBCs are, right? In the sense that, what do OBC stand for? OBC essentially means other backward classes. It's not, as a lot of people think, mean even other backward castes. And the interesting thing about this is that it really differs from state to state, right? Like you may be backward in one state, you may not be an OBC in another state. And that, while there's a lot of politics involved in that, there's also a lot of realistic assumptions as to why that's the case, right? In the sense that you may have some sort of strength in certain states, while you may actually be backward in certain other states. And OBCs in that sense are the group that's most diverse in terms of their material and social and political significance across. That's why that's the most heterogeneous group. It's also the largest single group in the Indian population. If you look at what the Indian demography is, I think we start by saying Hindus are around 78 to 79%. Then obviously there's minorities, and Muslims are around 14%, and then there are all the other smaller religious groups. Scheduled castes, I think, around 15% at a pan-India level. Scheduled tribes, I think, around 7.5%. Now there's no real census on upper caste and OBC since 1931, and of course there are differing definitions of what OBCs are, but it's safe to say that by and large across the majority of India, the single largest social group are OBCs, right? So OBC politics in that way, when you talk about OBC politics per se, it really, like when OBCs start playing a role as OBCs, or articulating particular caste or class interests, that's when you can definitively say that competitive politics has come to a state, right? And I'll elaborate on this in a bit. Now if you look at, say, a UP, right, like that's a or a Bihar, like you always start with UP and Bihar, right? When you start talking about UP and Bihar, the initial Congress coalition was always was basically a umbrella right? It was considered a coalition of the extremes because it had your upper caste Dalits and Muslims. Your upper caste were obviously especially Brahmins in the case of the Congress, were the top of the social pyramid, so as to speak, and Dalit were, you could say, in the power hierarchy at the bottom, and then there were minorities, and OBCs were the guys in the middle in UP and Bihar, and the real opposition to the Congress has always come from OBC community, in the sense that right from the socialists who were always backed by the OBC, the BJP, which in UP especially has always had a strong OBC base. So those were the first groups to sort of break the one-party domination of the Congress in the Hindi heartland. Now coming to a less discussed part of caste politics, right? If you look at Karnataka, Andhra, or even Maharashtra, right? Like Maharashtra, everyone talks about how the Marathas are the dominant players in Maharashtra politics, and again under the Congress, the Marathas dominated state politics, and they are not an OBC caste, right? Like while they're trying to get reservation, we'll discuss that later in our discussion. Marathas are not historically considered OBC caste, and opposition to the Congress system in Maharashtra, led by the BJP. Again, BJP in Maharashtra was very much an OBC part, in the sense that if you start with Gopinath Munde, considered the tallest leader of the BJP till he passed away a few years back by unfortunate circumstances, he was an OBC. If you look at other tall BJP leaders of the past, like Eknath Khadse, who's no longer there, he was also an OBC. If you talk about people today, Girish Mahajan, again an OBC. So there are lots of OBC leaders in Maharashtra. If you now move across the border to Andhra, Telangana, again the Congress had a landed caste, same thing, right? Landed caste of there, it was the Reddys primarily, and they were aligned with the scheduled caste. And the TDP tried to oppose that. They came up. TDP is considered a Kama party, but what a lot of people don't mention when they discuss the TDP is that TDP is primarily, while of course it is led and dominated by the Kama community, the bulk of its cadre and its foot soldiers come from OBC communities in Andhra. So you can see how in all these states, for the longest time, it's when the OBC started getting consolidated by an anti-Congress force. That's when real political competition came to these states, whether it's Maharashtra, Andhra, or for that matter in UP and Bihar, where of course it started earlier. But and to just give a counter example also, where the Congress actually played OBC politics, that is in Gujarat, right? The famous Kham coalition, which a lot, or rather the notorious Kham coalition, which a lot of people talk about, that where the K stands for Kshatriya, H is Harijan, A is Adivasi, and M is Muslim. So what happened in Gujarat was, interestingly, Gujarat was the one state where the Congress split in 1967. The Congress O was a dominant party there, right? Not Indira Gandhi's Congress, and that was broken by the Indira Congress leaders of that state by creating this Kham coalition, where they managed to fuse together OBCs. That's why the BJP in Gujarat, for instance, always depended on patidars, right, as the landed caste. So again, there the Congress, or rather the Indira Congress, was a challenger. So what you can see is really when the rise of the OBCs, that always the dominant party. And when I say the dominant party is in a post-independence, post-colonial like if you go to South Africa after democratic rule came after apartheid, it's always been one party, ANC, right? The African National Congress. It takes time for an opposition to develop. The same way it happened in India. In India, interestingly, the Congress had different social bases across different states. But one thing you can see for a fact is that the dominant social base in no state really had OBCs, right? Binding together OBCs was and probably remains the easiest way for anyone to break an established political system in India. There's a lot of interesting discussions on why that's the case, and some of it may be beyond the scope of this discussion. But I think that's a thought everyone can start off with.
Great opening remarks, Rohit. And OBC itself is a very catch-all terms, right? And it doesn't translate to the same sort of classes and communities across India. There's a huge variance in what it means in each state, right? And there's a recent amendment that gives the power to the states to decide who comprises the OBC category. How do you see that impact politics, and especially with UP coming up and so on?
So, just on this amendment, while I am technically a lawyer, I'm not fully well versed with the legal intricacies of this amendment. But just to tell you what the basics are, practically, it's actually just a restoration of the status quo, right? Because what happened was the Maharashtra Assembly passed a bill that gave Marathas reservation, and it increased the cap from this 50%, which was put in by the Indira Sawhney judgment, right, in the early 90s. So that was struck down by the Supreme Court, which also, said that the states couldn't add to the OBC list, which was never the case before, right? States always had the right to, tweak their own OBC lists, however they felt convenient within this overall cap. What also happened is that, of course, that what the Supreme Court probably wanted to prevent here was state governments are more susceptible to political pressure, right? In the sense that different communities want different slices of the pie, so they're just more susceptible to political pressure at a local level. And of course, if you look at it in a federal system, probably does make sense to have different communities, their status being decided at the state level, simply because that's where each state, especially among OBCs, the conditions are quite different, right? You may not be a backward community in one state, you may be backward in the other. Of course, there's scope for misuse, but broadly just takes power back to the states. This is especially important in these years, because what's happened is ever since 2014, you've seen a lot of these landed castes, demand reservations. And when I use the term landed caste, this is a very loaded term, right? Because when we talk about the politics of India from a primarily Hindi heartland perspective, right? And Hindi heartland, I mean just UP and Bihar, right? We sort of, miss out on this concept of a landed caste, because UP and Bihar, this OBC upper caste division is a lot more, relatively more straightforward. People sort of, have some idea of, which community is backward, which community is not. And while there are lots of conflicts on who's a scheduled caste and who's not, things are, at least on the OBC front, a bit more settled there. What's happened over the last several years is that India also has a lot of these communities which are considered landed castes, right? These are not traditionally, considered forward castes per se, but they are also, by no means of the imagination backward in the way it was traditionally used, right? Since these are the castes that actually control the land in the countryside. They're what you can call, the yeoman peasants, right? Like the bulk of the land, they may not be zamindars, so some of them are, but a lot of the land is actually in their control. And these communities are there across India, right? From Haryana, you have the Jats. In Rajasthan, again, you have the Jat. In Gujarat, you have Patidars. In Maharashtra, you have Marathas. Karnataka, you have Lingayats and Vokaligas. I'm just using a few castes, right? I mean, there are other castes also. In Andhra, you have, Reddis, Kammas, Kapus. In Tamil Nadu, you have a lot of communities, most of whom are anyway classified as OBCs, so I'm not taking them by name. In Kerala, you have Nayars. So what's happened is some of these, traditionally, most of these communities were not considered OBCs, right? And none of them actually are considered OBCs at a central level. A state level, I think Karnataka has had Lingayat and Vokaliga reservation for a while. Rajasthan Jats got reservations sometime in the late 90s, but otherwise, the bulk of these communities have not got reservation. They've been considered forward caste. And one of the trends of the last few years has been a tendency by these communities to demand reservation for a variety of reasons, right? Some of them are an assertion of power. Some of them are a demand for a greater share in the pie. I mean, why would you not want more reservations, right? I mean, something that probably helps you in a lot of ways. And the third thing is quite simply, they do have, like, when things have changed in India, when agriculture has become less remunerative as opposed to industry and services, especially post liberalization. And now I'm talking like P. Sainath, right? But I think there's some grain of truth in what he's saying, that agriculture is no longer as remunerative as it used to be in the past. And in terms of power also, the dynamics have shifted, right? Like, just because you're the landlord, you're no longer the be all and end all of things, even in most villages across India today. Some of these communities have responded to these by demanding reservations. It's also interesting to note that invariably these happen when they also lose political power. Like, for instance, this Jat reservation in Haryana, it really became very serious once Manohar Lal Khattar became the CM, right? Who's not a Jat and who was very loudly proclaimed as a non-Jat CM. And you could say his coalition, the people who elected him were also primarily non-Jat. So that was more of a reaction. It was primarily a political reaction. Something similar happened at the same time in Maharashtra, where Devendra Fadnavis again became a CM. He was a non-Maratha CM. The BJP in Maharashtra in 2014 really didn't have a lot of Maratha power, right? It was not a Maratha party. Again, Marathas saw political power slipping away, and that was one of the reasons. I wouldn't say that's the only reason why this happened, but that's one of the biggest triggers, right? Why there was a movement for Maratha reservation suddenly, and then there was this movement for Patidar reservation. That's slightly more complex and probably has more to do with internal dynamics in Gujarat politics than the rather more straightforward cases of Karnataka and Maharashtra. But these were three movements where states really thought that the easy way out was to just give reservation to these communities, right? The trick here is that you can't eat into the existing OBC quota. Almost all of these states were anyway at the 50% cap, so they had to just put something above the 50% that got challenged, and that's where the Supreme Court intervened. And this thing they went above and beyond what was the remit of that specific case by saying that states can't do anything at all, and that's what's sort of been reversed by this constitutional amendment. I mean, there was a lot of noise about it, but on all sides of the political divide, from the BJP to the saying that this was a revolutionary pro-backward move, to the opposition trying to question it, to the so-called trads on Twitter totally losing their cool about it. But by and large, it was a very status quo thing. So I mean, it really wasn't worth all the hype, if you ask me. But it was an important thing because it restored the status
So
quo.
let's double click on that for a bit, right? I mean, people say that it's a fairly convenient timing with elections coming up. And also, there is another thought that, I mean, this government has not been great on federalism and giving power to states and so on. But then, I mean, this is in the opposite direction of that, right? What do you make of all of these things? I mean, how do you see it?
So, see, I think elections always come up, right? I mean, that's not really a
Yeah.
reason in India to do anything. But what really happened in this case was this was done pretty fast. I think the judgment that is being nullified by this was passed only recently. So it didn't actually, it wasn't like something was put in cold storage for 10 years and taken out just before a UP election and sort of, try to make a song and a dance about it. And again, as I said, see, the most important election that's coming up in the immediate future is UP, right? I mean, there are a bunch of other small states, but they're not very relevant politically, with all due respect to our friends from Uttarakhand and Goa and Manipur and even Punjab. But they're not very relevant politically, and more importantly, none of these states have any real OBC politics per se, right? So when people say elections, people mean UP elections, and as I mentioned previously, UP, while everyone thinks it's this crucible of OBC politics and it's not an unfair description, UP is also a place where OBC categorization is pretty settled. I mean, there are not a lot of groups, who are suddenly demanding that they may be given declared OBCs or something like that. So that sort of immediate requirement wasn't there in UP. It's of course good signaling. Everything is good signaling in politics. On your federalism point, I mean, it's just restoring the status quo, right? And I mean, first of all, I don't agree with this view that there's been an erosion in federalism or anything over the last few years. I totally disagree with that, but this is not the topic for a further discussion on that. So I think the problem, but why I think it's important to mention that here and why you ask that probably is because, it's very easy today to say that anything is anti-federal, right? I mean, from leasing out an airport to, I was reading Team BHP, right? The car forum, the car owners forum, and there's someone who's saying that the new Bharat number plates are anti-federalism, and that's come because the Tamil Nadu finance minister PTR has said he'll increase road tax. So I mean, that's the kind of thing that's going on, and you can't really question these kind of narratives, right? I mean, like. I don't think the world is about PTR. Like, I don't think that's true, right? I mean, that's not why somebody will change the entire number plate system in India. So I don't think this has anything to do with federalism, but it can't really question that narrative because that narrative is not particularly grounded in facts, or at least it's grounded in a particular worldview. But leaving that aside, I think, this is important because states have to have that right? And today, only a state knows whether somebody is, a particular community is backward or not. And this again points to a deeper flaw that people think if something is done politically, the right answer to do that is challenge it judicially because you're not sure if, you can reverse it politically. And that's what the parliament has said, that political decisions have to be fought politically. Like if some group has a problem with somebody else being made an OBC, then fight it out electorally and decide what is to be done.
Okay, let's come to the topic of how different parties within India play this OBC politics, right? I mean, their angle to it. I mean, we saw earlier that, the likes of Lalu Prasad Yadav and Mayawati, and those were the doyens of this brand of politics, right? And but what we're seeing, especially over the last 5-10 years, is that the BJP has made very strident efforts to sort of be in the realm of this, right? I mean, they're gaining ground very quickly, and they're making a lot of progress on that front. So how do you view this whole sort of shift in the dynamics of what is happening between political parties?
So I think what you mentioned, right? I think that's actually not a very fair characterization of OBC politics and especially the BJP's role in it, right? I'll try to link this to my first response on the show. When I said that, what happened after independence was essentially that, you had a Congress dominant system across the state, right? I mean, sorry, across the country. And what a dominant system invariably does is it tries to fuse in people who are easy to fuse together. So, what the Congress primarily did in state after state was it fused together parts of the urban elite with the rural elite, right? So the rural elite invariably is your landed castes in, the Deccan and place like Gujarat, while in the Hindi heartland, it's actually Brahmins and Rajputs, right? especially Brahmins, because Brahmins are very big landowners in UP and Bihar. So that they fused together this particular group. So you had your Marathas, you had Patidars in Gujarat, you had you had your Lingayats and Vokaligas, especially Lingayats in Karnataka, Reddis in Andhra. So the same story, right, everywhere. They were fused together with certain vulnerable groups, especially Dalits and minorities, and that sort of created a coalition that was winning, that was easily able to win elections, right? Because especially the groups that were not, part of the coalition, they were too disorganized to really mount any sort of a resistance. Now, what the interesting thing here, and again, what I mentioned in my first response was that most of these groups invariably turned out to be OBCs, right? Like whether in Maharashtra it was, your what's called as the Madhwa coalition, right, of OBCs that the BJP created. So they were primarily OBCs. In UP, which is a very interesting state here, you had different OBC groups, right? Because you had the Yadavs, you had the Kurmis, you had the Lodh Rajput, you have the Mauryas, the Sainis, who weren't very prominent historically, but are much more prominent today. And you had a lot of these groups in different states, and different opposition parties, started working on fusing them together, right? Like in Madhya Pradesh, the BJP started working on a lot of OBC groups. The Lodhs, again, in Madhya Pradesh, they're the most prominent. Of course, in Madhya Pradesh, this was under a larger, rubric of Scindia politics, right? Because of Rajmata, Vijayaraje Scindia. But leaving that aside, the bulk of the voters came from, because they're the largest community, right? Especially when your scheduled castes are strongly with the Congress and even the scheduled tribes are, then you're like the bulk of your voting numbers come from OBC. In UP, you had you had Charan Singh starting his Ajgar move, Ahirs, Jats, Gujars, and Rajputs. Rajputs, of course, are not OBCs, but Rajputs across the Hindi heartland have had a bit of a love-hate relationship with the Congress, right? Zamindari abolition and, princely states, and Congress didn't have good relations with princely states, especially post the death of Sardar Patel. Of course, there were a few princes, but not really. Ahirs, that is Yadavs, Jats, Gujars, again, classical OBC community. The BJP worked on different communities like Lodh, which is where Shri Kalyan Singh comes in. Like he was the tallest leader of the Lodh community. Bharati was a Lodh. Again, someone who got prominence in the 80s. That's how it worked. The Congress upturned this in two states, right? In Gujarat, which I mentioned when Congress O was created, and similarly Congress O, because Mr. Nijilingappa was the biggest opponent of Indira Gandhi, right? When the Congress split. So she handpicked Devraj. He created this whole OBC movement in Karnataka against the landed caste. There again, while it was inside the Congress, it was an OBC movement. Like Siddaramaiah has now recharacterized it as Ahinda, basically what Devraj did. That's how it worked, and what happened and why there's disproportionate attention on Lalu Prasad and Mulayam Singh is because Bihar and UP together have 120 seats, right? And what 139 if you include Jharkhand and Uttarakhand out of 543, sorry. So that's very important. And what these two gentlemen realized was that in the whole fracas around Rajiv Gandhi's flip-flops on communal issues and the whole Babri Masjid movement, they realized that in both these states, there's a 20% Muslim vote, right? I think Bihar it's slightly lesser. That Muslim vote was up for grabs, and what these two gentlemen realized was if they just held on to their community, and you need to sort of see this primarily in that, right? And I'll get to what happened in UP especially later. What these there is a difference between UP and Bihar here. What these guys realized was that if you link Muslims with the OBCs, especially any segment of the OBC community, becomes a very huge number. In the numbers game, it just becomes big that you become sort of unbeatable. So what happened in Bihar, I'll get to first. So Bihar had a very particular politics, right? In the sense that the Congress had a very classical upper caste, Dalit and minority coalition, which was opposed primarily by socialists who were all primarily OBC leaders, like Nitish Kumar is a Kurmi, Lalu Prasad Yadav is a Yadav, BP Mandal, in whose name the Mandal Commission came, is again a Yadav. So these two groups, and because once the Muslims got disillusioned with the Congress, even the Dalits did. Once Ramvilas Paswan became the biggest leader, as opposed to Jagjeevan Ram, who had passed away sometime around the 80s, I think. It just became a huge numbers game, right? Because upper caste also got disillusioned with the Congress. They moved to the BJP. The BJP, unlike in UP, never really had much of a mass base in Bihar, so it became very easily characterized as an upper caste party. That's what happened in terms of OBC politics happened in Bihar for a very long time, till the Prime Minister, till of course Nitish Kumar first broke away, and that created this huge divide between Yadavs and non-Yadavs in Bihar, because it was felt that Lalu Prasad was favoring Yadav. And then the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, managed to further break that in 2014 when he took away all non-Yadavs and non-Kurmi. So it just became a game of further. Basically, you're going further and further into micro-level strategies, right? What happened in UP was slightly different in the sense that in UP, non-Congress communities were equally attracted to both the socialists and the Jan Sangh, right? So and Kalyan Singh is the biggest example of that. Like as an OBC, he was always in the UP BJP, right? He became the CM in 1990. So when today we are saying that OBC politics of the BJP is a recent phenomena, we need to remember that one of the biggest state in India, the first ever BJP CM was an OBC, and he got that power through OBC votes. I mean, of course, upper caste voted for him. In 1993, when SP and BSP first allied together, Kalyan Singh I think managed to get one seat less than the combined SP and BSP. Caste divides are a lot more apparent in an assembly election, right? Like in 2019, it's a Lok Sabha election. The BJP, 25 years down the line, managed to break SP plus BSP. This was done 25 years back by Kalyan Singh, right? I mean, that was because of OBC support. And what happened in UP, you could say that, SPs always had like a 26 to 27% vote share in UP, whether under Janata Dal or in any of its shapes and forms. That's primarily come from Yadavs, Muslims, and small sections of other communities, right? Never been the case that, Mulayam Singh Yadav has been the dominant OBC leader of UP. What happened was, we can discuss that later in more detail, but when Kalyan Singh broke away from the BJP, or rather had to break away from the BJP, that vote just went up for grabs, and that's when the SP first and the BSP took it over. That's why it was so easy for the BJP to just get it back in 2014, just by having a competent leadership and doing some sort of a smart micro level move. So that's where I think the BJP is always, because it was a challenger, right? As I said, the dominant movement in all states was to exclude OBCs from political power because it was simply convenient. These were disaggregated, smaller groups of people. It was easier to just already mobilize people, right, and unify them. So BJP, because it had to come from bottom, just started up and mobilized the OBC group.
So Rohit, any discussion on caste politics or indeed reservation, is remiss without talking about the Mandal Commission report, right? Or the socially and educationally backward classes commission, SEBC, that was set up under the government of Prime Minister Morarji Desai. Right, I think in 1980 they ruled that OBC is roughly made up about 52% of India's population, and they recommended about 27% reservation of jobs and so on and so forth. Right. So, what do you see as the impact of the Mandal Commission in the whole OBC political landscape as such?
It's a very interesting question, right? Because there's a very dominant narrative, and I don't want to fully challenge it on this podcast, which said that, there was this whole fight between Mandal and, Kamandal, which basically talks about the whole temple movement, right? The first thing about the Mandal Commission is that when it was implemented by VP Singh with this clear objective. Like his primary objective, of course, he may have been a great social reformer, but if you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, but if you want to purely analyze it from a political perspective, his idea was to, break the unity of the Hindutva movement, right? And because the Ram Janmabhoomi movement was at its peak, and VP Singh wanted to break that, and the easiest thing he saw was because the Ram Janmabhoomi movement's foot soldiers had a lot of OBCs, right? Like it was primarily an OBC movement. I mean, of course, all communities had a lot of role to play in it, but OBCs also had a big role to play, and VP Singh thought that he could break that by implementing this reservation. And what happened after that was. And this is very well explained by Vinay Sitapati in Jugalbandi. Right? Like Mr. L.K. Advani took this huge strategic move of basically saying the BJP wasn't opposed to Mandal. Right? What that did was, while of course, this Mandal versus Kamandal dichotomy has been peddled by so-called political scientists and analysts for the past 25 years. What this did was it actually took the wind out of the sails of, the Mandal politics, at least in UP. Because see, Yadavs today, like everyone today says Mandal politics is sort of outdated, right? But Yadavs are still with the SP. Yadavs were with the SP in the 90s also for other reasons. Primary reason was Mulayam Singh Yadav was a Yadav leader, right? And they saw that, very justifiably that their share of political power under any SP regime was always going to be bigger than that under the BJP regime. But the BJP was able to hold its own in UP throughout the 90s, right? I mean, the only election where they struggled till, Kalyan Singh had his fallout with Mr. Vajpayee was in 93 when the SP and the BSP got together. But other than that, the BJP was the dominant party for non-Yadav OBCs in UP through the 90s. The SP's largest numerical block of strength always came from Muslims. And the only time they could actually beat the BJP was when they allied with the BSP, which is of course an entirely different ballgame. I mean, the BSP has a different brand of politics, and even today, if the SP and the BSP ally, it requires a lot of work for the BJP to beat them in UP just because of numbers. Leaving that aside, in Bihar, as I explained, it's easy to say that Lalu Prasad ruled Bihar in the 90s because of Mandal, but it's also a fair this thing to say that Bihar was a bipolar state between Congress and the socialists, right? And by the 90s, the Congress had just about pissed off everybody in its social coalition. Like if you today look at Congress vote share in Bihar when it contests independently, which it hasn't done for many years, so it's difficult to understand, but it's probably around 5 to 6%. So when the BJP practically didn't exist outside Jharkhand and Patna and a few other places, so for them to actually grow and build it, it just took time. So it's very easy to say it was Mandal, but it probably wasn't, because the BJP in other states never really faced this problem with getting OBC votes, whether it was Rajasthan or at least in Lok Sabha elections, Madhya Pradesh, Assembly elections, Madhya Pradesh would take 10 more years, but you're not sure if that was electoral genius of Digvijay Singh or was it just Mandal. In Maharashtra, throughout that period, the BJP was very much a party of the OBCs. So I mean, it's not very easy to say that Mandal was as pivotal to explanations of Indian politics in the 90s as conventional wisdom makes it out.
Let's come to Shri Kalyan Singh itself, right? I mean, 5 decades in politics, two-time chief minister, and a long-time MP. What was the significance of Shri Kalyan Singh to this whole political movement?
So I think Kalyan Singh, as I mentioned when I first started speaking on the show, Kalyan Singh represents the fusion of OBC politics and Hindutva, right? In the sense that when the general perception of Hindutva is that it's an upper caste supremacist ideology, or that's what a lot of people want to portray it to be. Kalyan Singh, as the first BJP CM of UP, was literally a living opposition to that, right? And the way in which he managed to fuse OBC voters with the BJP throughout the 90s till he left the party, and that's a different story in itself, right? And I'll get to that. But that probably showed that how Hindutva, it was really the template of Hindutva, right? Like today, if Hindutva is primarily if OBCs, the party that most OBCs support in India today is the BJP, and through the Hindutva ideology, the template for it was set by Kalyan Singh. I'm not saying that people in OBCs in Maharashtra or Madhya Pradesh or Rajasthan were voting for the BJP because of Kalyan Singh. Reason, and that probably has more to do with the social structure of India in the 90s. Kalyan Singh could never have any role outside UP, but it just shows that it was a template, right? And obviously the Prime Minister Narendra Modi sort of worked on that template and put it out into action. But if you look at the 90s in UP, it shows that the BJP could get huge amount of OBC votes across assembly elections, across Lok Sabha elections, and that in a way primarily meant that if you're only an upper caste party, there are very few states in India you can win, right? Like you can win in Uttarakhand or Himachal, probably nothing more than that, or maybe with some exceptions even a Gujarat maybe, but probably not, but depending on how things pan out. But here in a very OBC dominated state, at least numerically if not politically, in the 90s, Kalyan Singh showed that OBC politics is not incompatible with Hindutva, and that's something, that's a template that I think the BJP has internalized. Was why he left the party, and what were the reasons for that. I don't want to go into too much of a detail right now, but there were severe personality clashes. And if you look at what happened to the BJP, right, like the 10 years that the BJP was out of power, the two Lok Sabha elections, both those elections, the BJP got 10 seats in UP. And of course, while Kalyan Singh was a part of the BJP in 2004, he was a much diminished Kalyan Singh, right? Like people knew that he wasn't, the same, he wasn't going to really have any serious power. His time had sort of passed. And the BJP sort of collapsed, right, in 2004 and 2009. 2014, the BJP recovered, and UP recovered nationally. Also important to note that, of course, how important UP is to the BJP, right? Just because of its peculiar geographical concentration, it doesn't have seats in some southern states, didn't have seats in Bengal, etc. UP is the most important state to the BJP, even more than to the Congress. And Kalyan Singh, was, you could say in that way, the prime architect of both the Atal Bihari Vajpayee governments, right, 98 and 99. So that was a template that everyone knew could be followed, and that's what the Prime Minister Narendra Modi did in 2000. You can see that in the sheer amount of respect that the Prime Minister gave Kalyan Singh, right, over the past 6-7 years, right from getting him back into the party, which was done, even though it was done before he became the PM candidate, he had a role to play in it. And once he became Prime Minister, Kalyan Singh was made a governor. His son was an MP. His grandson got his family seat as an MLA. He's made a minister in UP. Whole scenes around when he was ill, BJP President Mr. Nadda went, CM went. then finally, once Kalyan Singh passed away, the Prime Minister went. The BJP very much recognizes that Kalyan Singh, more than a lot of political observers give credit to him. Kalyan Singh was a very instrumental role in creating the modern BJP of today. And this happened 25 years back, right? So that gives it more credence.
Yeah, and he led a very eventful life as well, right? I mean, he was in the thick of things, during the whole, Babri Masjid demolition and Ayodhya at its peak as well. And many recount his response at that time, right? And as you mentioned, I mean, he also crossed paths with Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee as well. Can you recount any anecdotes or certain things he said during his life that, kind of stick out in memory for you?
I was speaking as a political analyst till now, right? But for a common person, the biggest thing about Kalyan Singh is that he was the CM when the Babri Masjid was demolished. It's probably one of the most defining days in independent India's history. It's like commemorated by everyone in some way or the other. And Kalyan Singh played the biggest role, right? I mean, if anybody else was the UP CM, it probably wouldn't have happened. And that's the cross Kalyan Singh bore with for his entire life, right? I mean, and you have to say that he bore it very proudly, right? I mean, on multiple occasions, he was given the chance to apologize. He refused to apologize. He made statements that, consistently reaffirmed that he believed what he did was right. And whatever his role in it was, and you could see that he clearly didn't have regrets that, I mean, he was dismissed as a CM. He had complete control over the government at that point of time. I mean, the BJP I think in the 1990 elections had a thumping majority, and which, BJP in UP never got till 2017 after that. Like his remaining terms as Chief Minister, Kalyan Singh always had to rely on, cobbled together alliances, defections. That's a whole story in itself. Jagadambika Pal, who's of course now a BJP MP, becoming CM for one day. Things like that. Probably none of that in a political scenario would have happened if he hadn't sort of, let's say, let things flow when the masjid was demolished, right? I mean, it was a conscious call he took for whatever his reasons were, and he by and large stuck to it. I mean, even when he finally aligned with, of all people, Mulayam Singh Yadav in 2009, and that was obviously more a reflection, I would say, of where the BJP was at that time and how the BJP was dealing with him than his personal politics. He still didn't apologize. Mulayam Singh, of course, paid a huge price for it because he lost a huge amount of his Muslim vote because of aligning with Kalyan Singh, which was pretty weird thing to do from his perspective. So that way, you could say the defining thing about Kalyan Singh was his refusal to, in any way apologize for what happened with the Babri Masjid. And of course, there are iconic interviews of him, right? I mean, probably seen a few. I've seen a few. Then there's some speeches where he said the same thing. That's by and large what happened. And of course, beyond that, his whole career basically went for a toss after around 1998 with his whole intestine feuds with Atal Bihari Vajpayee and a lot of people who were close to Atal Bihari Vajpayee in Uttar Pradesh, right? And it was not like Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Kalyan Singh had a personal fallout. There were issues in UP that just escalated to the Vajpayee, some form or the other. And, the interesting thing is that, like, while Kalyan Singh, he formed two parties. He contested, I think, the 2002 assembly election as well as the 2012 assembly elections independently in his own Jan Kranti or Rashtriya Kranti party. But he never could make much of a mark himself. He was quite able to destroy the BJP, right? And when we link it to the last time I was on this podcast to speak about Mr. Yadurappa, I think there was a clear similarity, right, between two people who both, sort of were key to the BJP in their states, left the party on bad terms, didn't prosper much on their own outside, finally came back and, sort of managed to take the party back to where they had left it. Of course, Kalyan Singh was much older than Yadurappa, so he didn't do it personally, but it would be a bit churlish to deny that his Ghar Wapsi, so as to speak, didn't have any, sort of a role to play in it. And interesting thing is, both of these leaders came back to the BJP due to, the role played by the Prime Minister. So one person who clearly, understood where the BJP probably went wrong in its decade away from central power and very clear in correcting it.
All of us have seen that interview of his where he was pushed to, respond on the whole Babri Masjid demolition, and he said, "No regrets, no repentance, no sorrow, no grief." Right? I think those are iconic response, right? You mentioned Mulayam Singh, and there's a very interesting relationship between the both of them, right? Shri Kalyan Singh and Mulayam Singh as well. What was it about UP in that time period that it made for such a complex political battle?
I think in UP ultimately boiled down to the Ram Janmabhoomi, in the sense that it was the whole reaction around this that basically broke the Congress coalition. of upper caste, Dalits, and Muslims, right? I mean, it was that coalition that is by and large holding fort against the socialists on one side and the Jansang slash BJP on the other. And when that coalition broke, what Mulayam Singh and what Charan Singh, Mulayam Singh, Ajit Singh, I mean, a bunch of people on the socialist side did was they managed to, tie in the Muslims to their side of the coalition, and the BJP managed to tie, upper castes and other groups that were committed to Hindutva to their side of the coalition, right? So that's what essentially happened. And of course, Kalyan Singh and Mulayam Singh, interestingly, are both, OBC leaders from neighboring districts, right? I mean, Kalyan Singh is, while he is from Aligarh, his political base, the seat not the assembly seat, but the Lok Sabha seat he represented, which his son has been representing, is Etah. Mulayam Singh, while he's from Etawah, by and large stood from Mainpuri. These are neighboring districts in, southwestern UP. Two communities that by and large also are OBC communities, again concentrated in the same regions, Lodhs and Yadavs. Because Yadavs are slightly more in number, but and that's where they both sort of saw where they could, gain accretive votes. Obviously, Kalyan Singh wasn't as representative of the BJP in a way, say Mulayam Singh is of the Janata Dal or the Samajwadi Party, but that's how that played out, and that's probably why Mulayam Singh was so eager to give Kalyan Singh a home when Kalyan Singh felt abandoned by the BJP. Of course, that led to disastrous consequences for Mulayam Singh himself, but it just represents the two ways in which anti-Congress politics in the Hindi heartland emerged. Right, one was on Hindutva, and the other was on aligning, or rather depending on the Muslim vote. And Mulayam Singh and Kalyan Singh came to represent the two different conceptions of it, right? In a way that, nothing in Bihar ever matched that, because Bihar had a different history. UP politics, and UP is, of course, the largest state, is the crucible of Indian politics. So these two gentlemen, they just showed differing ways in which how post-Congress India could evolve. And I could say Mulayam Singh's vision probably won for Kalyan Singh's vision probably dominated the 90s, but Mulayam Singh's definitely dominated the 2000s. And of course, I think today you could definitively say Kalyan Singh's vision dominates India. And I think the interesting part is probably, and I say this more in the context of UP, but in the 10 years where Mulayam Singh's vision dominated India was more due to the BJP messing up, right? BJP did a lot of self-goals during that period, which if it hadn't done, probably you could say that the entire period from, say, 1989, 1990 to today would have been somewhat, defined by the kind of politics Kalyan Singh symbolized.
All right, Rohit, to kind of round things off, right? I mean, we've spoken a fair bit about how Hindutva meshes with OBC politics as well. How do you see this relationship evolving going into the future, and do you see certain challenges to that?
So that's a very interesting question, right? In the sense that, see, what does Hindutva do? Hindutva's, and a lot of people have made this observation on today's BJP, right? It's at the same time the most inclusive party India has seen, because it consciously makes an effort to include all sorts of Hindu, or I would say even Indic castes and communities, right? Using a very loaded term, because it tries to go out of its way to appease even, Sikhs or Buddhists for that matter. But it does, sort of display a rigidity when it comes to Islam, or at least political accommodation of, political interests of Islam. I would say that's a better way of putting it. Displays that rigidity, so it's simultaneously inclusive and exclusive. And this only works, at the time when you can really keep to unite, Hindus together, right? I mean, and OBC are, of course, a part of this, but you can see multiple fault lines already emerging, right? We discussed the whole caste issues with caste reservation issues, Jats, Patidars, Marathas. None of these are OBC communities, but they demand reservation. That has its own ripple effect. Second thing is, you see a lot of attempts by anti-BJP OBC organizations to mobilize OBC youth against the BJP, using some of the old things like BJP's anti-Mandal, anti-backward. They managed to link it also to certain things, right? Like, for instance, it's well known that the BJP has reduced recruitment to government jobs, right? And OBCs are more, interested in that as opposed to, say, the upper caste. Of course, not everywhere that's true, but broadly, because the communities that have reservation are bound to get impacted by reduction in government jobs more than other communities. So that's a definite fault line that the BJP needs to look out. Second thing is that, when you're in power, it's bound to happen that, some anti-incumbency comes up against. Now you have this whole fuel, you have the whole COVID, right? I mean, and COVID again, I mean, disproportionately hits the working poor, the lower middle class. Again, all people who are disproportionately more likely to be from OBCs. What is the government's response to that? Of course, the government has done certain things. How much people accept it, you don't know. You have the whole fuel hike issue. some of these things are bound to hit certain groups more. I think OBCs are probably higher up on that list than say certain other group. You have the attempt to do identity politics. The next one, of course, is trying to mobilize. You have this whole attempt at mobilizing different Hindu castes. What we discussed with Patidars or Jats. People are trying to do the same thing with inside OBC communities. So this whole game will keep going on. If you have like Chhattisgarh, for instance, the Congress managed to the only state in India where the Congress, at least at a state level, has a stranglehold on the OBC votes because the BJP had an upper caste leadership in Chhattisgarh. Congress was able to promote OBC leaders from different communities, like Bhupesh Baghel, the CM is an OBC. Tamaraధ్waj Sahu, who is sort of projected as a CM candidate, is from another OBC community. So so tomorrow, in some other state, like for instance, if the Congress finds somebody from say an OBC community in some state, or of course Mulayam Singh, I mean the SPA and the RJD are the biggest examples of this, right? Like Yadavs are just not going towards the BJP whatever happens. It's not because Yadavs have an inbuilt aversion towards the BJP. They just realize using pure cost benefit analysis that an SP government is better for them. So if some other caste is able to find that thing, you can see micro parties emerge like Nishad party in UP, the VIP in Bihar, which is also party representing Nishads. You have the Apna Dal, which is today with the BJP, but you don't know what will happen. You have the SBSP of Om Prakash Rajbar, which is again representing a very small, very politically as of today not so influential, but numerically large OBC community in eastern UP. You have the Mahan Dal, which tries to do it for another OBC community in UP. As all of these people try to play up their caste roles, that's only going to hurt Hindutva, right? I mean, because once you start thinking of yourself as a caste group and not in the religious group, that's going to hurt Hindutva. And I don't know how the BJP is going to handle it. They've handled it successfully till today, but there are a lot of challenges ahead.
All right, that's an interesting note to end the podcast on. Thank you so much again, Rohit. I mean, this was fascinating. I always say that Indian politics is so diverse, right? And it's really amazing, like the different nuances that you can bring out across the political spectrum itself. So thank you so much again. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Roshan. Always great to be here.